All right. Welcome to class, everyone. Today, we'd like to welcome our C-SPAN viewers that are joining us, our class today. We're going to be covering a lot today. This class, for those of you that are watching at home, is a course focused on business and society here at Colorado College. And this class in particular, we're looking at the making of the U.S. drug war, and particularly how it relates to the prohibition and now the legalization of cannabis and how that impacts consumer access to this particular substance. I've been doing research ethnographically and historically on the drug war and cannabis legalization for the last 2 decades. So you get to join us today on our tour of the last 100 years of drug policy. So as you remember yesterday, we were talking a little bit about the impact of culture and science on our approaches to medicine and conceptualizing what is an acceptable substance for medical consumption and what marks those substances that are different from medicine. So today we're going to try to see how those very ideas actually impact the laws that govern our access to these substances. So we're going to start just over a century ago with the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906. This is something that impacts us into the present and really helps to control our access to a whole range of substances. So the law itself is focused on consumer protection, right? We don't want the American public to have access to substances that could potentially be dangerous. This can be something as simple as we've seen in the past few years, having contaminated lettuce and other produce on the market that could cause a public health scare in the nation. This policy also helped to create the Food and Drug Administration that still continues to govern much of these issues around consumer protections when it pertains to food substances and substances that we classify as drugs. So it required clear labeling of products, and in the early 20th century, this was particularly important as the regulatory structure was not in place to be able to know what we were actually putting in our bodies, right? So you could go to a local vendor and have access to substances, cough medicines, sleep serums, that had quantities, measurable quantities of substances like opiates, right? Heroin syrups for cough, coca in products that we would be using as over-the-counter medicinal products. So the federal government really tried to implement this policy to be able to limit access to those substances and also to protect us as consumers from being able to consume products that we could deem as safe. Now, as this especially becomes important for our class and our discussion because it's the first policy that really starts to bring cannabis into a discussion with other substances that we now deem as more dangerous, at least in some circles, than this other natural plant substance, right? So particularly those substances that were deemed addictive, including alcohol, opium, cocaine, heroin, morphine, and cannabis had to be clearly identified on products, right? So that we wanted to know as consumers whether we were putting these potentially problematic substances into our bodies. Now we follow that up shortly thereafter with the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, right? We've now have a policy in place that's really set up to control opium as a consumer good, right? That's to be purchased medicinally. However, there was still the presence in the U.S. of opium in smokable form. And this was designated as different from the previous conceptualization of opium products as being necessary for medicinal consumption, right? So we start to see now, already in the early 20th century, this sort of division and bifurcation of our conceptualization of substances as being for medicinal use and for non-medicinal use, right? Oftentimes, non-medicinal use gets characterized as quote-unquote recreational use, right? Now, in the case of opium, we have a particularly important case because it's very important as a medicinal substance that many people want access to. However, we also have the presence of a population that is relying on opium in smokable form. This particular act actually bans the possession, consumption, and importation of opium in smokable form. And I have two other historical events that actually help us to understand and make sense of the Smoking and Opium Exclusion Act. And that's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, so we're going back even further, a few decades. And that is because the Chinese actually come in to settle parts of the West to aid the U.S. in its development of the western half of the United States as laborers, right? So they're doing a lot of the grunt labor work in the western United States, help to build the railroad from connecting the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And as such, they also bring the practice with them of consuming opium in smokable form. We start to see, especially in the western half of the United States, places like San Francisco, even places here in Colorado, like in Denver, the establishment of these opium dens where people are, where Chinese people are consuming smokable opium, right? That started to be deemed as a problem by the federal government for a couple of reasons. Because this was seen as something very foreign and different, right? So Chinese men primarily coming into the U.S. and bringing with them a foreign practice that seems to be characterized as a problem really starts to spark the public interest, right? And initially, it starts to create anti-Chinese sentiment that results in 1882, the first real sort of exclusionary immigration policy. And that's to say, after 1882, we're going to ban in the U.S. Chinese immigrants from coming into the U.S. if they're coming in as laborers. If you're coming in as a non-laborer, then you could be exempt from the Chinese Exclusion Act. At the same time, in 1898, we have the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. is able to, as a result of being victorious in the war, is able to acquire several protectorates in Puerto Rico, Guam, and especially for this case, the Philippines, where the presence of smoking opium is deemed as a problem for now having just acquired this new area of the world to govern, right? So as a result, we start to see the intersections now of race and substances start to enter the political discussion. This becomes especially as important as we just talked about with the Pure Foods and Drugs Act, because that limits now access, legal access to opium-based products, right? And as we've seen in the contemporary period, what happens when we cut off legal access to particular substances is we usually see a type of black market emerge where people now have to navigate to access a substitute for the substance that they just lost, right? So there's replacing behavior that takes place, and what ended up taking place in the case of opium is those individuals that no longer had access to opium-based products through a legal system now start to frequent these opium dens in these Chinese communities, right? And as a result of that, we start to have these increasing concerns about Americans going into these racialized neighborhoods, these Chinese neighborhoods, and engaging in behavior that's seen as deviant, right? So all of this really coalesces these ideas around trying to control these substances in a whole range of both international and federal efforts to really rein in greater prohibition over these substances. So in 1909, just after the Smoking and Exclusion Act, we have the International Opium Commission in Shanghai. A commission is different from, as you'll see in a second, a convention, because this was mostly a meeting for countries interested in starting to more strictly regulate opium to be able to start to make suggestions for how we were going to navigate at an international level access and control to possession of opium. That's followed up in 1912 with the International Opium Convention, the first international drug control treaty. And as part of this meeting, right, the nations involved, of which the U.S. is a sort of strong proponent, really start to craft the first international drug policy to say we're all going to do our part as a global community to really limit the movement of this substance that we see as potentially harmful for our different publics. It also starts to initiate the process for partner countries in this agreement to be able to implement their federal policies to limit the access to these substances. In the case of the U.S., we end up with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, right? Notice that it's not an exclusion act, it's not a complete prohibition act. This is an effort at trying to control access through taxation, right? It's a business approach, a regulatory approach to try to really keep the substance in the hands of those that we see as particularly resourceful for being able to keep us from entering a public health problem, right? One thing to remember is that this is a moment that the American Medical Association and the profession of medicine is starting to become more and more heavily professionalized. So we look to the medical community to weigh in with suggestions for how to best navigate access and control of this substance, opium, and a whole range of other narcotics, to be able to have it available for medicinal use, but also try to limit access of this substance in a non-medicinal use. So what it did is it especially regulated and taxed opiate and coca products. The reason why this is important, as you'll see in a second, in a few decades it becomes a sort of metric to be able to launch future drug policies in the U.S. So now that we're talking about limiting medical access and also really trying to quell any sort of access to non-medical use, the U.S. initiates the Narcotics Drugs Import and Export Act of 1922, and this creates the policy for oversight for the opium trade and opium consumption. And this is because we do not have the ability to produce opiate and coca products in the U.S. These are plants that are really thrive in other global settings. In the case of the U.S., coca is primarily produced in South America, in the Andean region. And in the case of opium products, we have a large access to opium in northern Mexico, but we don't have the ability to really grow and produce opium in the boundaries of our nation, right? So we have to figure out a way, if we're supposed to be able to allow access on a medical front, we have to figure out a way to be able to import these substances and have control over them as they're entering the nation, right? To be able to regulate that access. Another important component of this is that it establishes the Federal Narcotics Control Board as a law enforcement entity to police narcotics, right? We'll see this organization start to transform into the present to be able to better navigate our drug laws and to be able to better punish and regulate possession of these substances, right? And in particular, it was tasked with policing non-medical consumption as well as engaging in quality control of the narcotics for medicinal use, right? This is back to the Pure Foods and Drugs Act, that if you're going to be allowing access to a substance, it has to be something that won't be necessarily harmful to a consumer ingesting that substance, right? So the Federal Narcotics Control Board was really tasked with trying to figure out a way to do both, right? To say we're going to limit non-medicinal use. If you're going to need medicinal use of coca-based or opium products, we need to figure out a way to best ensure the safety of those products. Now that entity morphs into, in 1930, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And instead of being part of the Department of Justice or any other sort of federal entity, it actually is established as part of the Department of Treasury. We have to remember that these are not outright prohibitions on these products. Instead, they're shaped around tax policy, right? And as such, the entity that polices these practices has to be in an organization, a federal entity that is best able to exercise its jurisdiction around these matters, right? So in this case, drug law in the early 20th century is really all based around tax policy, so it has to be part of the Department of the Treasury. So it replaced the Federal Narcotics Control Board. Its first commissioner, Harry J. Anslinger, was at the head of this entity from 1930 to 1962, right? So that's, just over 3 decades of one individual really having control over our drug policy in the United States. That leads to particularly one-sided effects in the case of how we're about to see drug policy transform post-1930, right? The important thing to remember about Anslinger is that he pushed for harsher drug penalties, right, and for further criminalizing of drugs. And in this case, we have something particularly important for our area of study in that he really targets including cannabis in this sort of understanding of drug control as a narcotic, to be able to think of cannabis as something more similar to opium and coca than dissimilar. We'll see him again, don't worry. Because he's the chief architect of the Marijuana Tax Act that we see deployed in 1937. This act was tasked with taxing the sale of cannabis and marijuana. And in particular, Anslinger used stories of problematic use of cannabis in Mexico and in the U.S. Southwest, and its association with Mexican immigrants that were starting to come into the U.S. Between 1910 and the 1930s as a result of an ongoing civil war in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 to roughly 1920 really sparks the sort of mass exodus of Mexicans from Mexico into the U.S. And as we've already talked about, cannabis consumption was a part of Mexican culture and indigenous Mexican populations. But Mexico also had problems with the consumption of cannabis, and so they exported these negative ideas about what cannabis can do for people's mental health and what it does in terms of these outbursts of violence for the consumers. Now, what Anslinger did is he basically took those stories that were circulating in Mexico and used that as a justification for why we needed to think about cannabis more like problematic substances like opium and coca, and why we needed to have more strict enforcement and policing of this substance. Now his suggestions really actually fly in the wake of, as we talked about earlier, looking to the medical community to provide guidance on these issues. So the American Medical Association actually opposed the Marijuana Tax Act because it was going to make it highly burdensome for medical professionals to be able to use cannabis as a medicine for their patients. And in particular, the tax was actually imposed on the physicians, the pharmacists, and the medical cannabis cultivators that were being able to grow the supply market for patients that were in need of cannabis as a medicine, right? We have an important piece of history that we have to contend with here at the local level, because the first Marijuana Tax Act arrest actually takes place in Denver, Colorado. Moses Vaca is charged with possession, and Samuel Caldwell is charged with dealing, and they're in violation of the Marijuana Tax Act, because part of what the Marijuana Tax Act imposed is that if you wanted to be in possession of marijuana, is that you had to petition the government for a tax stamp to be able to be in possession of that, right? It's your documentation to say, I'm not in violation of the law, I have this cannabis legally. However, the problem was, in order to acquire the tax stamp, you had to present the cannabis you were trying to acquire. And as we'll see in a little bit, that becomes an issue for how this law is actually intended to really stop access to cannabis as a medicine. In terms of the outcome of the Marijuana Tax Act, Baca as a buyer is sentenced to 18 months in prison at Fort Leavenworth, and Caldwell is sentenced to 4 years for dealing, right? Both in violation of the Tax Act as consumer and as seller. Now, the Marijuana Tax Act also didn't come out of nowhere. It's important to remember that because of our own sort of approach to government in the United States and federal versus state policy, that many states were already on the path to outline access to cannabis, right? This makes it a more favorable national policy to pass, right? So in this case, you can take a look at this timeline. In 1911, Massachusetts restricts the sale of cannabis. However, in 1913, we start to see more and more outright bans of cannabis for any possession, production, consumption. So 1913, California, Maine, Wyoming, and Indiana are responsible for these first bans. Later in 1915, Utah and Vermont. In 1917, we have a policy in Colorado to make the possession and cultivation of marijuana a misdemeanor, right? So we are also in Colorado not just at the forefront of legalization, we're also at the forefront of prohibition, as we can see, because it predates the federal prohibition of cannabis. 1923, Iowa, Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. 1927, New York, Idaho, Kansas, Montana, and Nebraska. 1931, Illinois and Texas. And then by 1933, as we're seeing the ramp up to the Marijuana Tax Act, North Dakota and Oklahoma join in the list of states that ban cannabis possession, consumption, and cultivation. We'll take a quick little detour to talk about the 18th and 21st Amendments. These are important pieces of history because they show the sort of clear approach to prohibiting access to a substance and what the federal government has to do when that prohibition actually fails, right? So as a lot of you are familiar with, in 1917, we have an amendment to the Constitution that prohibits the sale, consumption, possession of alcohol. But after less than a couple of decades, we actually basically have to undo that, right? So we have to approach the fact that alcohol prohibition was unsuccessful, leads to a large black market, the increasing proliferation of organized crime to be able to provide consumers with access to that substance. And the federal government sees that as more of a problem than it's worth to just be able to go back and undo prohibition. And so in 1933, we have the repeal of prohibition, and now the U.S. has access to, as we can see, a whole range and plethora of alcoholic substances. The follow-up policy after the Marijuana Tax Act is what's referred to as the Boggs Act of 1954. This in particular becomes important because it's how we navigate post-1950s the punishment of drug crimes. So we require mandatory sentencing for drug crimes because from a moral standpoint, the federal government really starts to frame drug crimes as a failure of morality and something that we really have to punish from a very harsh standpoint, right? So in the case of cannabis, this becomes particularly important because less than 2 decades after the passing of the Marijuana Tax Act, we have the Boggs Act that really gives the Marijuana Tax Act greater teeth because it now results in a minimum of 2 years in prison to have a cannabis crime on your record, and it could lead to a fine of up to $20,000. Now, if you saw, in the case of the first Marijuana Tax Act arrest, that means that Moises Vaca's sentencing would have actually been harsher, right? He was only sentenced to 1.5 years, really, of prison time, and under these new regulations, he'd have to be sentenced to a minimum of 2 years, right? So it creates the logic around drug punishment that requires us to be really forceful with these crimes that are viewed as failures in morality. We'll continue that into the present, really, and something that we're still trying to undo as part of our U.S. drug policy. So we're going now a little to reference international law as it pertains to the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. This is the follow-up of the Opium Convention that we've already discussed of the early 20th century. So in 1961, as a result of all this escalation of drug control in the U.S. And around the globe, partner countries of the United Nations come together to try to figure out how to best revisit the transnational movement of these substances that we're trying to control and how better to enforce these policies. So they come up with the Single Convention, which is an international treaty to prohibit unlicensed, illicit drug production and distribution. It still allows for these substances to be able to be used, cultivated, right, produced for medicinal purposes. However, we have a strong emphasis on cannabis, opiates, and coca that are all included in the agreement, trying to figure out how to really put an end to the consumption for non-medicinal use of these substances. An important component of this is that it introduces the scheduling of substances. Right? Scheduling is these ideas framed from a policy perspective and a medical professional perspective of how can we classify drugs as substances that we need to regulate but also still have access to. Right? And so the scheduling system for the Single Convention looks a lot different than I'm sure you've heard about in everyday conversation. It really has a more circular understanding that there are 4 schedules. You have to consider the medical utility, potential harm of a substance, and those factors are a way to be able to craft a policy that would allow or not allow medicinal use for the substance, the ability to prescribe, in what quantities, and really sets up a hard and firm regulatory framework for how to think about the medical community being able to access and the scientific community be able to access these substances for knowledge production around its medical utility. This is also important in terms of the U.S. because it, around all partner nations, it really governs how governments are able to control the cultivation of these substances, particularly marijuana, for testing to gain a greater knowledge base about the impact and effects that this has on persons' well-being and personal health, right? The Single Convention is expanded through the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, adds a whole range of substances to the list. Also important, we move away from not just the use of narcotic, but also scientific language that's being really developed and popularized to more accurately talk about the effects of these substances on our brain, right? So if we talk about narcotics, this becomes an issue in the history of drug policy because it's a fairly rigid definition that has to be expanded and maneuvered through to be able to include more and more substances in there, right? So the term narcotic really just means, comes from words meaning to numb, right? And so in that case, it was highly applicable to opiates and coca products. But when cannabis is introduced as part of a narcotic substance framework, that becomes an issue, right? And we start to talk in 1971 about other substances like mescaline, like psilocybin, that have different psychoactive effects. The regulatory community has to figure out a way to be able to reconcile the fact that these substances that we're talking about don't all have the same effects, even though we want to be able to heavily restrict and regulate access to them. And then in 1988, the UN follows it up with the Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances, and this is because from 1961 to really the mid-'80s, we see a proliferation of large-scale organized crime to be able to provide consumers around the world with access to these prohibited substances, right? So this is where we see really the intensification of large-scale drug smuggling around the globe. And here we get to an important moment in U.S. drug legal history because it is something that we don't really often think about and the type of influence that it has on our drug policy into the present, right? So Timothy Leary, if you're not familiar with, a sort of infamous professor from the 1960s that was a strong proponent of the use of psychoactive substances for a whole range of health benefits, including the use of psilocybin, cannabis, acid, LSD, to be able to really allow for humans to have mind-altering experience that could be beneficial for themselves and their mental health. Now, as a strong proponent of the psychoactive substances, in December of 1965, he actually goes down on a family vacation to Mexico. He, as a psychoactive substance consumer, he goes out and purchases some marijuana that he's consuming while on vacation, and then he tries to return to the U.S. and re-enter the country through a port in Laredo. And as he's entering, there's this sort of misunderstanding, and he's subject to a vehicle search. And as part of the vehicle search, border agents discover small amounts of dried flower cannabis and especially seeds in his car. And as such, they charge him with a violation of the Marijuana Tax Act, and he's basically supposed to be sentenced on these violations, as we've seen. However, here you have Timothy Leary, an individual, a professor that's highly educated, that figures he can do some research to get his way out, right, of this legal bind that he's in. And so what he discovers is, and through the work of his legal team, that the Marijuana Tax Act is actually unconstitutional. Because as I mentioned earlier, right, if you wanted to be in possession of marijuana, you'd have to get a tax stamp, right? The only way for the government to give you the tax stamp is you'd have to present the marijuana that you were trying to get the tax stamp for. Now that's an issue because it violates the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution around self-incrimination, right? You can't give me a tax stamp if I don't have marijuana that I'm trying to get to pay a tax for, and I can't be in possession of marijuana if I haven't gotten the tax stamp yet. So it was causing individuals that wanted to have access to marijuana this self-incrimination, right? And so he's able to convince the Supreme Court in this decision in Leary versus United States, 1969, that's decided in May to deem it unconstitutional for its violation of the Fifth Amendment. The U.S. does not rest on this, right? So because we have this court decision that basically declares the Tax Act unconstitutional, aside from the whole range of other drug policies that we just talked about that should allow for strong control of the substance, we see that for at least a short period, the U.S. is in limbo around its policy for how to prosecute marijuana possession, cultivation, importation. So what it does is, shortly thereafter, in September of 1969, it launches Operation Intercept at the U.S.-Mexico border. What's happening is that September is the harvest season for marijuana, outdoor-grown marijuana in Mexico, and so they were expecting this large influx of marijuana at the same time that we don't have the teeth to potentially really sort of criminalize and prosecute this possession of this substance. And so what the U.S. does as part of the Nixon administration is just send as many officials as it can to the U.S.-Mexico border. It mobilizes all of its border agents, and it essentially shuts down the U.S.-Mexico border for 10 days to try to stop Mexican marijuana from entering the U.S. And that's important because at the time, something between 70 and 80% of the marijuana consumed in the U.S. was sourced from Mexico, right? Now that's sort of short-lived because we actually are able to reinforce our marijuana policies very quickly thereafter through the passage of the Controlled Substances Act. And this is probably the one that you've heard about the most as really sort of controlling our drug policy in the U.S., right? So it's passed as Title II of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. And it also does a very important thing as far as international law, right? Because at least prior to the revocation of the Marijuana Tax Act as unconstitutional, we at least had that to be able to be in accordance with international drug policy. However, we had yet to implement the UN Single Convention on a federal level to be able to sort of mirror the policies that we have at an international level with our federal policies. And what the 1970 Controlled Substances Act does is it really pushes the sort of framework, the international framework of drug control into a federal policy. We have what we know of in the U.S. context as drug scheduling on a 5-schedule scale that's based on potential for abuse and medical utility. And so what we need to know is that as far as scheduling is concerned, a Schedule 1 substance is deemed as having a high potential for abuse and a low potential for medical utility, right? Those two factors combined make it to where classification of a substance as a Schedule 1 drug makes it very difficult to access at all through a legal channel, right? And as we move down the scheduling scale, those factors just are adjusted, right? So a Schedule 2 substance has a lower likelihood for abuse and has some medical utility until you get down to Schedule 5 substances that we should be able to access with limited government regulation and interference. The other important thing that the Drug Controlled Substances Act does is that it creates these drug-free school zones that will be reinforced through other legislation into the future to make it so that possession or attempted sale of prohibited substances in drug-free school zones, that includes parks, that includes a whole range of other areas, child care centers, that would allow for a harsher punishment of violators of the Controlled Substances Act, right? So, yeah, if I have, a gram of marijuana and I'm, somewhere in an area that isn't considered a drug-free school zone, I'm sure I'm subject to mandatory minimum sentencing. However, those sentences get to be harsher, fines get to be considerably higher in close proximity to these drug-free school zones. This becomes really an important part of how we see into the present the drug war targeting particularly communities of color in the U.S., right? Communities of Hispanic and Latinx descent, and also African American communities, right? Because they tend to be in close proximity to these drug-free zones. Possession of those substances in those areas make it harder to have a fair and balanced justice system around drugs, right? The other important thing is that we have the establishment now of the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973, replacing the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And an important component of this is that we see in the decade running up to the Controlled Substances Act, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics moved over as the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs to the Department of Justice, right? So we've left the sort of tax world, right? And we've now entered the world of crime and justice, right? And so we have greater flexibility in how we exercise the punishment of drug violations, but also the ability to better navigate between institutions of the Department of Justice to really give the drug war teeth post-1970. And these last couple of policies that we're going to be focusing on really are salient because they start to shape what is then going to have to be navigated through as we start to see states try to really push back and swing prohibition into some sort of legal access to the substance, right? So the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988 are two policies that really do a whole range of things. They create international pressure for the eradication of drug crops in source countries, right? So we're having such a hard time really stopping the flow of these substances into the U.S. We're not seeing a demand reduction in terms of U.S. consumers. How can we limit access to these substances? Well, we now have the ability, using the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, using the UN conventions of 1988 at this point, to be able to go into source countries like Peru, like Colombia, and eradicate coca crops. Go into Mexico and fly over marijuana crops and spray pesticides, right? This becomes a really volatile issue politically because it involves the human rights violations of a lot of individuals in these source countries, right? If you're starting to see spraying of harsh pesticides and chemicals to destroy these crops, and their close proximity to indigenous villages or communities in Latin America, they're being exposed to harsh chemicals as part of this drug control policy that has problematic effects for the health of that population, right? It also, as some of you in the classroom might be familiar with, pushes and promotes the drug abuse prevention and education platform that we know as the Drug Free America sort of program and DARE, right? These programs that go into schools now to be able to try to get young people, right? If adults are not limiting their consumption of these substances, let's see if we can use an educational platform in schools to educate these students to not become consumers of these substances, right? We also have policies as part of these anti-drug abuse acts to really engage in money laundering control, right? If we can stop these entities that are engaging in cross-border smuggling, that are bringing these drugs to market, if we can really cut off their supply to cash flow as part of the sales of these substances, maybe we can start to have an impact on cross-border smuggling of prohibited substances. It also helped to establish the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and this is really, in the present, the sort of government entity that really drives and pushes forward how we approach and think about drug control in the U.S., right? Another important component of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act is that it now brings cannabis into the mandatory minimum law framework, right? And this is why, for example, we have authors like Michelle Alexander and the New Jim Crow really argue that post-1980s, we have the sort of reinstitution of the drug war in this really sort of targeted fashion, right? Because if cannabis is the most widely consumed substance, if we use these mandatory minimums and we apply them to cannabis, and we can use drug-free school zone laws in urban centers to be able to target communities and sentencing, then it makes the ability to try to push a harsh prohibitionist agenda have a really lasting impact on these communities, right? Additionally, as part of that, it also implements the harsher punishments and targeting of the crack market at the same time that we see the punishments for other substances like powder cocaine remain relatively stable in the 1980s. And now we go into why this becomes important for us into the present, right? At the same time that we just talked about this sort of rapid escalation of drug control across the board at a federal level, we're also seeing states really grapple with whether this is the best idea moving forward, right? And so states start to engage in legal policies to try to pull back some of the controls around cannabis. And so in the case of state decriminalization, many laws start to think, well, is there a way we can not have to use federal policy to punish cannabis crimes? So we see decriminalization start to take place in 1973, where states like Texas, for example, allow for you to be in possession of up to 4 ounces of cannabis and have it just be a misdemeanor crime, right? So it's not a felony crime, and it doesn't then bring in a whole range of these other policies that we just talked about, right? So that the state can handle these violators, keep them in the state or local court system so that they are not subject to these harsher federal penalties. At the same time, in 1996, we see the growth with California and Arizona, the growth of state medical marijuana laws, right? We have to remember that escalation really cuts off access to cannabis as a medical substance. So states now have to try to figure out how they can use state policy to really start to provide access to this substance as a medicine for people. And a whole variety of states figure out different ways to approach the issue, and we still see states into the present trying to implement their own medical marijuana policies to figure out how best to do that, right? More recently, in 2012, we've started to see a range of states not just think about medical use of cannabis, but also just the adult use of cannabis. So how can we more effectively at the state level regulate access to a substance that's prohibited on the federal level and still have the type of drug control policy that will limit access to youth, that will have a strong enforcement arm, that will allow for, as we saw, 1904 Food and Drugs Act, allow consumers to know what is safe for them to consume, right? And so this is something that we'll be grappling through in the rest of the class, right? How can we look at this legal history of prohibition, specifically targeting cannabis, to know how the state governments have to really find ways around this long history of escalation of drug prohibition to provide both medical access to cannabis and adult use to cannabis. So I hope this helps inform our discussion through the rest of class. I hope this was informative for our viewers at home to know where our policies actually sort of originate and how they've impacted our ability to access certain substances and the sort of effects that they've had on our society into the present. Thank you.